The house descended into chaos, the disturbances becoming more overt and malicious, as if the unseen force had been angered by Matt's defiance. Each passing day brought new horrors, and the family's grip on reality began to loosen. The tension within the household grew unbearable, with fear overtaking reason and mistrust driving a deeper wedge between them. The following night, the power went out without warning. The house was plunged into darkness, an oppressive silence enveloping it. Then the banging began. Doors throughout the house slammed repeatedly, the sounds echoing like thunder in the void. In the kitchen, the stove's ignition clicked on and off incessantly, the rhythmic noise punctuating the cacophony. The family huddled together in the living room, paralyzed by the relentless barrage of sounds. The entity was no longer content with subtlety. It was announcing its presence in a way that could not be ignored. When morning came, the house was a wreck. Furniture had been overturned, drawers emptied, and objects scattered haphazardly across the floors. The walls were streaked with mysterious substances, their origins and purpose a haunting mystery. On the staircase, cans had been restacked in neat, deliberate towers, as though mocking the family's attempts to maintain order. Exhausted and terrified, Susan cleaned while Matt remained stoic, his skepticism unchanged even as the evidence mounted around him. The events that followed cemented the reality of the haunting in Susan's mind. The word cat appeared scrawled across the walls in jagged letters, written over and over in what looked like a dark red substance. The word covered every visible surface, from the living room walls to the kitchen cabinets. Susan's heart sank at the sight, a deep, instinctual dread overtaking her. The connection to the destroyed figurine was undeniable, and she felt the weight of the entity's anger. That evening, the girls retreated to their rooms, their shared fear now driving them into isolation. Marie stayed in her room, staring at the walls as if waiting for something to happen. Jamie, unable to sleep, kept her lights on and her phone close. The house felt alive, its oppressive energy seeping into every corner. No room felt safe, and no hour passed without the sense of being watched. The most chilling incident occurred while Marie was home alone. Susan and Matt had been reluctant to leave her behind, but circumstances left them with no choice. Marie settled in the living room, trying to distract herself with television. The screen flickered, the images cutting in and out before the TV abruptly turned off. A moment later, the remote slid off the table on its own, landing on the floor. Marie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The rocking chair in the corner began to sway, its movements slow and deliberate, as though someone had taken a seat. The pictures on the walls began to fall one by one, the frames clattering to the floor in quick succession. Marie grabbed her camera, the one she and Jamie had started keeping close to document the strange happenings, and snapped several photos of the room before fleeing upstairs. The photos revealed what the family feared most. Floating orbs of light hovered in the images, their shapes distorted and ethereal. They moved in erratic patterns, caught in the act of something unseen. When Susan and Matt returned home and saw the evidence, even Matt could no longer deny that something unexplainable was happening. The weight of the photos and the chaos they returned to pushed him to a breaking point. Matt decided to seek outside help, something he had vehemently resisted until now. He reached out to local churches, hoping to find a priest or pastor who could intervene. A pastor came and prayed with the family, offering what comfort he could, but admitted he could do little else. The family was left to face the escalating terror on their own, with no clear path forward and no way to escape the torment of the house. As the days passed, the disturbances grew even more violent. Doors slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Objects were thrown across rooms, and eerie whispers filled the air. The house had become a battlefield, each day a struggle to endure its relentless attacks. The family was pushed to their limits, their relationships fractured, their nerves frayed. The house no longer felt like a home but a prison, each room a reminder of the entity's control. Susan felt a deep sense of hopelessness, trapped by financial constraints and the disbelief of those who might help. She struggled to protect her daughters from the escalating horrors. The family's bond was crumbling, the strain of the haunting driving them apart. The entity seemed to thrive on their despair, its presence growing stronger with each act of defiance and each moment of fear. The sanctuary, once a place of hope and new beginnings, had become a nightmare from which they could not wake. The house loomed over them, an omnipresent force that refused to be ignored, its intentions as mysterious as they were terrifying. The family could only endure, hoping for a way out that seemed increasingly out of reach. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood in Southern California, a modest house became the fresh start Susan Lewis had long hoped for. The house, with its sunlit rooms and welcoming facade, seemed to offer everything Susan and her teenage daughter, Jamie, needed to rebuild their lives. After years of turbulence, this new chapter felt like a blessing. They quickly christened their home the Sanctuary, a fitting name for a place that promised comfort and safety. The pair settled into their new lives with ease. Jamie, bright and curious, adapted well to her new environment, spending her afternoons exploring the backyard and arranging her room to reflect her vibrant personality. Susan, on the other hand, took comfort in the mundane tasks of homemaking, finding joy in arranging furniture, painting walls, and creating the cozy home she had always envisioned. Soon after their move, Susan's boyfriend, Matt, joined them. Matt brought with him a calm demeanor and a willingness to help, integrating seamlessly into their lives. His teenage daughter, Marie, arrived shortly after. Strikingly similar in age to Jamie, the two girls quickly formed a bond, often disappearing into each other's rooms to share secrets or laugh over the latest social media trends. Together, the four of them began to form a new family unit, filled with laughter and a sense of togetherness. The sanctuary became a hive of activity. On weekends, the family hosted small gatherings by the pool, with Susan expertly managing the grill while Matt played lifeguard to the girls. Evenings were spent lounging in the living room, the hum of the television mingling with the clink of dishes from the kitchen. For Susan, life finally felt stable, as if all the pieces had fallen into place. Yet, beneath the surface of their idyllic life, subtle cracks began to form. The house, though charming and serene, carried an inexplicable weight. First, it was easy to dismiss. A faint creak here, an odd chill there. Quirks of an older home settling into itself. Susan barely noticed these minor oddities, too engrossed in the bliss of her fresh start. As the days passed, the house seemed to breathe alongside them, an entity quietly observing its new occupants. The air inside carried a heaviness that could not be explained. Shadows flickered in the corners of vision but vanished when confronted. The hum of the refrigerator, usually a background noise, seemed to grow louder at night, almost rhythmic, as if mimicking a heartbeat. Still, these things were trivial, easy to brush off as tricks of the mind or the product of the house adjusting to new inhabitants. Susan often found herself pausing during her routines, struck by a vague sense of unease. There was a peculiar sensation of being watched, though she was always alone when it occurred. She chalked it up to stress or an overactive imagination, not wanting to taint the joy of their new home with irrational fears. The weeks rolled by, and life in the sanctuary continued its gentle rhythm. Yet, as content as they all seemed, the house itself seemed restless. It was as though it struggled to settle, its essence shifting subtly, almost imperceptibly. And while the family laughed and played within its walls, the sanctuary silently waited. It was not the haven it seemed, and soon, its true nature would reveal itself in ways none of them could have anticipated. The family teetered on the edge of collapse. The house had turned into a relentless force of terror, its unseen entity no longer content with subtle manipulations or displays of power. It had become bold, targeting each member with calculated malice, eroding their unity and testing their resolve. Susan, Matt, Jamie, and Marie were shells of their former selves, drained of strength, trust, and hope. Susan's attempts to shield her daughters from the escalating chaos had taken their toll. She moved through the house with a constant weight on her shoulders, her nerves frayed and her thoughts scattered. Every corner, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards seemed to harbor a threat. Yet she pushed on, determined to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a situation that defied comprehension. Matt, once steadfast in his skepticism, had begun to unravel. The mounting evidence of the paranormal, the inexplicable photos, the synchronized disturbances, the physical manifestations, had shattered his confidence in the rational world. He now moved through the house with an air of forced bravado, his frustration and helplessness simmering beneath the surface. He had exhausted all practical avenues, reaching out to priests, pastors, and even local paranormal investigators. But no one could offer a solution. Their plight was theirs alone to bear. Jamie and Marie had retreated further into isolation. The once vibrant energy that defined their friendship had withered, replaced by mutual suspicion and unspoken blame. Each girl spent her days locked away in her room, their doors shut tight against the unknown. The house had robbed them of their joy, their trust in one another, and the sense of safety that home should provide. Then, one evening, the house made its intentions unmistakably clear. The family had gathered in the living room, a rare moment of unity as they clung to one another for comfort. The air grew heavy, the temperature dropping noticeably. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. A deep, resonant thud echoed from the staircase, followed by the sound of objects tumbling down the steps. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie stillness. When the family cautiously approached the stairs, they found them lined with objects once again. Cans, stuffed animals, and kitchen utensils were stacked in deliberate patterns, as though mocking their earlier attempts to reclaim control of their home. At the base of the staircase lay a broken mirror, its shards scattered across the floor like jagged teeth. The sight filled Susan with a dread she couldn't shake, a feeling that the house was sending a message. That night, the family experienced their most harrowing ordeal yet. The disturbances began in the dead of night, pulling them from restless sleep. The walls seemed to come alive, vibrating with an otherworldly hum. Doors slammed open and shut, the force rattling their frames. The house groaned and creaked, as though its very structure were protesting against their presence. In the kitchen, cabinets burst open, their contents spilling onto the floor in a cacophony of noise. The refrigerator door swung wide, and jars of condiments fell to the ground, shattering on impact. In the living room, furniture moved of its own accord, scraping loudly against the floor. A chair tipped over, then another, until the room was in complete disarray. Upstairs, Jamie and Marie's rooms were overtaken by chaos. The girls huddled on their beds as objects flew across the room, propelled by an unseen force. Books toppled from shelves, clothes were yanked from drawers, and their windows rattled violently in their frames. Jamie clutched her camera, snapping photos through the chaos in a desperate attempt to document the nightmare. In Susan and Matt's room, the disturbances were no less severe. The closet door banged repeatedly, as though something inside was trying to break free. The air grew colder, and a heavy sense of dread pressed down on them. Susan clung to Matt, her fear overpowering any remaining anger or resentment between them. The crescendo came when a deafening crash echoed through the house, louder and more jarring than anything they had experienced before. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, shaking the walls and floors. The family gathered in the hallway, their collective terror written on their faces. It was clear that the entity was no longer content with driving them apart. It was preparing for something far worse. The final straw came when Jamie discovered a new message scrawled across the walls of her room. The word "leave" was written over and over, the letters uneven and jagged, as though carved with desperate urgency. The sight broke something in Susan. She knew they could not stay in the house any longer. No financial hardship, no logistical challenge could outweigh the need to protect her family. The next morning, Susan made the decision that had been haunting her for weeks. They would leave no matter the cost. The house had become a prison, its walls closing in on them, its unseen force pushing them to the brink. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. Survival meant escape, and they could not afford to delay any longer. The house had won, but they still had their lives, and that was all that mattered now. The day was warm, the kind of summer afternoon that invited laughter and relaxation. Outside, the pool sparkled under the sun as Matt splashed about with Jamie and Marie. Their laughter echoed across the backyard, blending with the rustling leaves and the faint hum of cicadas. Inside, Susan busied herself in the kitchen, preparing a simple lunch for the family. As she reached for a loaf of bread, her eyes fell on the countertop, and she froze. A jar of peanut butter sat there, its lid off and tilted on its side. A thick, oily liquid oozed from the jar, pooling on the counter before dripping onto the floor. The sight was perplexing. The peanut butter looked melted, yet the house was comfortably cool, the air conditioning maintaining its steady hum. Her first thought was one of exasperation. She envisioned one of the children clumsily knocking the jar over and failing to clean up the mess. She instinctively checked the room's temperature again, wondering if the air conditioning had faltered without her noticing. But everything seemed normal, aside from the inexplicable state of the peanut butter. Susan wiped up the mess, her mind juggling plausible explanations. The scene felt oddly out of place, as if the jar had spilled itself. She tried to rationalize it, chalking it up to clumsiness or forgetfulness. Still, the incident lingered in her thoughts, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Her heart felt a twinge of unease, a faint whisper that something wasn't quite right. Once the counter was clean and the floor wiped down, Susan pushed the incident aside. She returned to the business of preparing sandwiches and snacks, determined not to let a minor mess disrupt their perfect day. Outside, the sound of the children splashing in the pool provided a comforting backdrop, a reminder of the harmony they were building in this new home. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the family gathered their belongings and made their way inside. The warmth of the day gave way to a cool breeze, and the house welcomed them with its familiar stillness. But as they stepped through the door, they were met with a sight that defied explanation. Cans from the pantry had been meticulously arranged on the stairs leading to the second floor, each step holding a neatly stacked tower of food. The sight was bizarre and unsettling, the randomness of it almost playful. Yet it was not just the cans. Around the house, objects had been placed in strange, deliberate patterns. In the bathroom, shampoo bottles were stacked atop one another, and hairbrushes formed a precise star on the counter. In the microwave, a chaotic mix of items, peanut butter jars, canned goods, and stuffed animals were crammed together. Under the kitchen sink, the cleaning supplies had been pulled out and lined up on the floor, organized from shortest to tallest. Oddly colored streaks adorned the walls, smears of what appeared to be condiments or soap, their origin as mysterious as the mess itself. The house had transformed into a scene of disarray, each room bearing its mark of the strange and the unexplained. The silence stretched thin, an oppressive weight settling over them. The mess was unnerving, but more so was the lack of an explanation. The idea of an intruder briefly crossed Susan's mind, but there had been no sign of forced entry. The doors were locked, the windows secure. The eerie patterns and strange arrangements didn't fit the profile of a break-in. Each family member wrestled with their thoughts, their minds grasping for a rational cause. The harmony that had defined their life in the sanctuary began to fray at the edges. The house, once a haven, now felt foreign, its walls holding secrets they couldn't comprehend. Susan and Matt, desperate to regain a sense of normalcy, set about cleaning the house. The task was laborious, each misplaced object and peculiar pattern a reminder of their growing unease. As they worked, the tension between them simmered. Their thoughts turned inward, suspicions forming in the privacy of their minds. By the time the house was restored to order, the day had drained them of energy and joy. They retired to their rooms, the weight of the evening pressing down on them. Yet, in the back of their minds, the unease lingered. The house had whispered its first warning, and though they tried to ignore it, they couldn't shake the feeling that the sanctuary was not as peaceful as it seemed. The house's malevolent energy became more personal, targeting each member of the family in unique and terrifying ways. The unseen entity seemed to study them, finding ways to exploit their vulnerabilities and deepen their isolation. Fear was no longer shared. It became private, festering in silence as each family member wrestled with their own terrifying encounters. Marie's ordeal came one evening when she was home alone. The family had grown wary of leaving the house unattended, But that night, it couldn't be avoided. Marie, left to her own devices, curled up in the living room with the television on for comfort. The familiar glow of the screen and the murmur of a sitcom provided a thin layer of normalcy, a barrier between her and the oppressive atmosphere of the house. The peace shattered abruptly as the TV began to flicker. The screen alternated between static and darkness before switching off entirely. Marie sat frozen, gripping the armrest of the couch. Her pulse quickened as the remote slid off the coffee table, landing on the floor with a soft thud. She stared at it, willing it to stay still, but it moved again, sliding further away as if dragged by an invisible force. The room grew colder, and the rocking chair in the corner began to sway. The motion was slow and deliberate, as though someone unseen had taken a seat. Marie's breath hitched as the pictures on the walls began to fall one by one. The sound of glass shattering filled the air, punctuating the otherwise eerie silence. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. Summoning her courage, she grabbed the camera she and Jamie kept nearby for documenting the activity and snapped several photos of the room. The action broke her paralysis, and she fled upstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. When her parents returned, she showed them the photos. The images were chilling. Bright orbs of light hovered in the room, their erratic movements captured mid-motion. Even Matt, the ever-skeptic, could not dismiss the evidence staring back at him. Jamie's encounter came only days later. She was alone in her room, the door shut firmly against the rest of the house. The faint sound of banging reached her ears, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. The sound came from her bedroom door, as though someone or something was trying to break in. Each bang sent vibrations through the floor, the force of it making her bed tremble. For hours, Jamie sat curled on her bed, her body tense and rigid. The pounding on the door never relented, rhythmic and unyielding. The air in her room felt heavy, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The overwhelming sense of being trapped with no escape left her paralyzed. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Eventually, the banging ceased. Gathering her courage, she approached the door and opened it cautiously. The hallway beyond was empty, but the evidence of the attack was undeniable. Deep dents marred the door's surface, and the handle on the outside had been bent downward. On the floor, a chaotic pile of utensils, pots, and pans lay scattered, as though the entity had used them in its assault. Jamie's terror reached its peak when she noticed the flickering light coming from the nearby bathroom. The door, lacking a knob, had a hole that allowed her to peer inside. Through it, she saw the light stutter and sway, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering bulb. A sense of foreboding overcame her, and she decided to trap whatever was inside. Using a piece of string, she looped it through the hole and pulled the door shut. The moment she tightened the string, resistance met her efforts. Something on the other side was pulling back, its strength nearly overwhelming. Before she could react, the string snapped, and the door swung open violently. Jamie stumbled backward, bracing herself for whatever might emerge, but the bedroom door slammed shut in front of her. Moments later, smoke began to seep under the door. Rushing out, she found a small fire in the hallway. A frying pan sat on the floor, with a toilet paper roll engulfed in flames, the paper unraveling like a wick. Jamie quickly smothered the fire with a sweatshirt, her panic mounting as she realized the entity had attempted to trap her and set the house ablaze. The hallway was a mess of strewn toilet paper and papers, a deliberate act of malice designed to harm her. When Susan and Matt returned to find Jamie sitting on the front steps in tears, they finally acknowledged the full extent of their situation. The entity's actions had grown increasingly dangerous, and the family's fear had reached its zenith. The sanctuary was no longer a home. It was a battleground, and they were its unwilling participants. The breaking point had arrived, and survival demanded a choice none of them were ready to make. The decision to leave the house brought a flicker of hope, but it was dim and fleeting. The realization of what it meant to abandon their home settled heavily on each family member. They had poured their lives into the sanctuary, crafting a space that was meant to be their safe haven. Now it had become a battleground, and they were retreating with nothing but their lives. The final days in the house were spent in a whirlwind of hurried packing. Susan directed the effort, her movements precise and purposeful. Despite the fear that lingered in every corner of the house, she avoided unnecessary trips up and down the stairs, wary of the unseen force that seemed to thrive in the spaces she couldn't easily see. Matt, for all his earlier skepticism, worked alongside her in tense silence. The weight of his unspoken acknowledgement of the haunting was clear in his furrowed brow and restless glances. Jamie and Marie packed their belongings with trembling hands, their rooms bearing the marks of the entity's wrath. Clothes were folded quickly, stuffed into bags without care, as they avoided looking too long at the walls that had witnessed so much chaos. The lingering word, leave, etched in jagged letters on Jamie's wall, seemed to pulsate with an energy of its own, urging them to hurry. On the day of their departure, the house felt alive with tension. The air was thick, heavy with a sensation that Susan could only describe as watchful. As they carried boxes and bags to the car, small disturbances continued around them, as if the house was protesting their escape. The lights flickered sporadically, doors creaked open despite being locked, and faint thuds echoed through the walls. In the final moments before leaving, Susan stood in the empty living room, staring at the disarray they were leaving behind. The furniture, the decorations, the memories. They all felt tainted, stained by the presence that had driven them out. She felt no sadness, only a deep, aching relief that they were getting away. As Matt locked the door behind them, a loud crash came from within the house. The family froze, their eyes locked on the door. For a moment, Susan thought Matt might go back inside. But he didn't. He simply tightened his grip on the key and walked to the car. The sound reverberated in her ears as they pulled out of the driveway. A final, chilling farewell from the house. They drove away without speaking, the silence in the car heavy but not unwelcome. Each of them was lost in their thoughts, processing the events that had unfolded and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. They had no plan, no new home waiting for them, only the knowledge that they couldn't stay. It was a fragile kind of hope, but it was hope nonetheless. The financial toll of their decision was immediate. Susan and Matt knew they couldn't sell the house, not with its reputation and the damage it had sustained. They defaulted on the mortgage, their credit ruined. Susan declared bankruptcy to prevent further financial collapse. It was a devastating blow, but one she bore without regret. The safety of her family was worth any cost. The family relocated to a modest apartment on the other side of town, far from the house and its memories. The space was cramped, their belongings limited to what they could carry during their hasty departure. Despite the challenges, there was a newfound sense of peace. The absence of unexplained noises, moving objects, and oppressive dread was a relief they hadn't fully anticipated. Slowly, they began to rebuild. Jamie and Marie started to heal, their relationship inching back toward the closeness they had once shared. The weight of suspicion lifted as they realized the true source of their torment had never been each other. Matt softened, his skepticism replaced by a quiet humility. He rarely spoke of the house, but his actions showed a man determined to make amends for the tension his disbelief had caused. Susan found solace in the small moments of normalcy that had once felt so elusive. Cooking dinner without fear of an interrupted power outage, folding laundry without finding it scattered across the floor. These simple acts became her anchors. The memories of the house lingered, but they no longer held the same power. They were scars, reminders of what they had endured, but also of their resilience. Months passed, and life began to take on a semblance of normalcy. The family learned to laugh again, to share meals without the weight of unspoken fears. Yet, there were moments when the past resurfaced. A loud noise in the night, a misplaced object. Each could send a ripple of unease through their newfound peace. They had escaped the house, but the echoes of its presence remained with them. Though the house sat vacant, it did not remain untouched. Neighbors reported strange lights in the windows, shadows moving when no one should have been there. One by one, The homes around the sanctuary emptied, their occupants leaving without explanation. The street became a ghost town, its silence a testament to the malevolence that had taken root. Susan, Matt, Jamie, and Marie never returned to the house. They spoke of it sparingly, their words careful and measured, as if to avoid summoning its memory too vividly. The entity had taken so much from them, but it had not taken their will to survive. In the end, that was their triumph, a fragile but enduring testament to their strength in the face of the unknown. The house had grown restless, its once comforting silence now filled with an almost palpable tension. The disturbances became more frequent, more targeted, and increasingly impossible to dismiss. It was as though the house had begun to assert itself, demanding attention in ways that could no longer be ignored. Jamie and Marie's rooms bore the brunt of the activity. Their belongings were routinely displaced, their once organized spaces reduced to chaotic messes seemingly overnight. Drawers were left gaping open, their contents scattered across the floor. Shelves, meticulously arranged just hours earlier, were left barren, their items strewn in haphazard piles. The girls often awoke to find their personal items inexplicably damaged or rearranged, as if by an unseen hand with a cruel sense of humor. The tension between Jamie and Marie escalated as the events continued. Each girl silently harbored suspicions about the other. Jamie convinced herself that Marie was seeking attention, using the disruptions as a way to create drama. Meanwhile, Marie grew wary of Jamie's pointed glances and abrupt silences, suspecting her of orchestrating the chaos to shift blame. Their once close friendship dissolved into an uneasy truce, each retreating further into their own bubble of mistrust. Susan's growing unease was mirrored in the subtle changes to her routine. She avoided walking through the house alone, often finding an excuse to remain in the company of others. Her nights became restless, her mind replaying the events of the day, searching for logical explanations that no longer seemed to exist. She began to notice fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision, shapes that disappeared the moment she turned her head. The sensation of being watched became an ever-present companion, leaving her on edge even in the brightest daylight. Matt, however, remained resolute in his skepticism. He dismissed Susan's concerns as paranoia and the girls' accounts as childish imagination. To him, the disturbances were nothing more than poorly executed pranks. His refusal to entertain the idea of something unexplainable only deepened the divide within the family. Susan's attempts to reason with him were met with dismissive comments, further isolating her in her growing fear. One afternoon, as the girls sat in Jamie's room trying to salvage their strained relationship, another incident unfolded. Jamie stepped into the hallway to grab a sweater from the linen closet, leaving Marie alone at the desk. When Jamie returned moments later, she found her bed soaked in coffee. The cup, which she had left on the desk beside Marie, was now overturned and empty. Marie, still seated, looked up in confusion, her expression mirroring Jamie's rising panic. The silence between them was heavy, both knowing that neither had moved the cup. That same evening, as the family gathered for dinner, a loud crash echoed through the house. Rushing to the source, they found a picture frame shattered on the floor. Before they could process what had happened, another frame fell, landing with the same force and precision. The sequence felt deliberate, as if each crash was a calculated interruption meant to instill fear. Susan's frustration and fear reached a boiling point. She began to explore unconventional solutions, desperate for a way to reclaim control of her home. After confiding in a close friend, she was advised to attempt a peace offering, a gesture to appease whatever force might be causing the disturbances. Though the suggestion seemed outlandish, Susan latched onto it, seeing it as an opportunity to take action rather than remain a passive victim. With the girls reluctantly in tow, Susan gathered items she believed would symbolize goodwill. A small figurine of a cat, one of her most treasured possessions, was placed in the center of a table surrounded by candles. As she prepared the offering, she spoke aloud, hoping her intentions would be understood. Her words were hesitant, her voice trembling, but the act itself felt significant, a moment of defiance against the unseen force that had upended their lives. As Susan's faith in the offering grew, so too did Matt's frustration. When he returned home early from work and saw the scene, his anger boiled over. He stormed into the room, snatched the figurine from the table, and hurled it into the backyard. Susan and the girls froze, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. Matt, unrelenting, dismissed their protests and stormed off, convinced he had put an end to their nonsense. But when they turned back to the table, their shock deepened. An identical cat figurine sat in the exact spot where the first had been. It was as though the house itself had refused Matt's rejection of the peace offering. Susan's heart sank, a cold wave of dread washing over her. The house was responding, and its answer was clear. Matt, unwilling to acknowledge the unexplainable, smashed the figurine on the ground. The act felt like a provocation, a deliberate challenge to the unseen entity. The family's unease turned to outright fear, the fragile veneer of normalcy shattered by Matt's defiance. That night, the house seemed to come alive with new intensity, its presence undeniable and its intentions increasingly hostile. The days following the strange events in the house were heavy with tension. Susan, Matt, Jamie, and Marie moved about as if navigating an unspoken minefield, their routines marked by an underlying unease. Though no one spoke of it, the eerie rearrangements and unexplainable messes lingered in their minds, casting shadows over the warmth they had worked so hard to cultivate. The house felt different, as though it held its breath, waiting. The usual sounds of creaking floorboards and humming appliances took on an ominous quality. Every small noise, a soft thud, the rustle of leaves against the windows, seemed amplified, each one a potential harbinger of something worse. The once familiar walls now felt oppressive, their quietude laced with an unsettling energy. It didn't take long for the strange phenomena to return. This time, the focus of the inexplicable chaos was Jamie's room. Jamie and Marie had been spending the afternoon together in the space, their quiet companionship a brief reprieve from the growing discomfort in the house. When Jamie stepped out for a moment, leaving her cup of coffee on the desk, she returned to find the cup overturned, its contents soaking into her neatly made bed. Marie, still seated at the desk, appeared oblivious to the spill. The incident might have seemed minor, but its implications were unsettling. Jamie, aware that Marie hadn't moved, struggled to rationalize how the coffee had ended up on the bed. The tension between the two girls began to grow, fed by the unspoken suspicions that each harbored about the other's involvement in the ongoing disturbances. Their once close bond started to fray, small cracks appearing in their friendship. Later that day, as Jamie cleaned the mess, she set a bottle of bleach on her dresser, turning her attention momentarily to the bed. She was startled to find the bleach spilling out, its cap inexplicably removed. The liquid seeped into her clothes, ruining them. Jamie couldn't explain how it had happened, and the realization that she had been alone in the room when it occurred only deepened her unease. The events didn't stop there. As the family went about their evening routines, more disruptions followed. A picture frame fell from the wall with a sharp crash, its glass shattering across the floor. Moments later, another frame toppled, landing mere inches from the first. The sequence felt deliberate, as if unseen hands were at work, systematically dismantling their sense of security. Susan's composure began to waver. The logical explanations she clung to, pranks, accidents, coincidences, felt increasingly hollow. The children's strained interactions only added to her stress. Jamie's mistrust of Marie grew with each incident, and Marie, in turn, began to withdraw, retreating to the safety of her room whenever possible. The house, once alive with the sounds of laughter and companionship, grew quiet, its occupants consumed by their own suspicions and fears. Matt, however, refused to entertain any notion beyond the mundane. To him, the disturbances were nothing more than childish antics. His skepticism, combined with Susan's growing belief that something unexplainable was happening, ignited a rift between them. The shared laughter and light-hearted banter that once defined their relationship were replaced by sharp words and cold silences. As another week passed, The house seemed to take on a life of its own. Items continued to move inexplicably. Liquids appeared in strange places, and an air of hostility permeated the rooms. Susan began to notice patterns in the chaos, a sense of intent behind the disorder. The arrangements of objects and the targeted nature of the incidents hinted at a presence, something unseen and perhaps malevolent. One evening, as Susan stood in the kitchen surveying the latest mess, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sensation was overwhelming, a prickling awareness that made her skin crawl. She turned abruptly, her eyes scanning the room for an intruder, but she found nothing. The space was empty, the silence oppressive, yet the feeling persisted, lingering like a shadow just out of sight. In the days that followed, Susan found herself avoiding certain areas of the house. The stairs, with their steep rise and eerie echoes, became a place to rush past rather than linger. The basement, dimly lit and cavernous, was avoided altogether. Even the kitchen, once the heart of their home, held a sense of foreboding. The house had begun to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. The family's once strong foundation began to crumble under the weight of their growing fear and mistrust. The shared meals and family activities that once brought them together became rare, replaced by solitary meals and evenings spent in separate rooms. The house seemed to thrive on their discord, feeding on their fractured bonds and amplifying their unease. The disturbances escalated, each one more bizarre and unnerving than the last. Objects moved when no one was looking. Strange liquids appeared in impossible places, and the air grew heavy with an indescribable energy. The house was no longer just a backdrop to their lives. It had become an active participant, an entity that seemed intent on tearing them apart.